Welcome to Avon Talks. I'm your host, Jim Pavish. William Faulkner once said, "The past is never dead, it's not even past." When we look at recent events, we have the benefit of both having lived through them as well as the capability of having looked at them through the objective eyes of the future. Today we're joined by Avon resident Professor Stephan Bullard from University of Hartford, a respected scholar whose book, COVID-19, The First 6 Months, traces the daily advances and setbacks as they happened. In this conversation, he brings clear, grounded perspective on how the crisis unfolded in places like Avon, how it reshaped life across the country, and what ripple effects look like around the world. Whether you lived through it on the front lines or felt its weight in quieter ways, Professor Bullard helps us understand what truly happened, what we learned, and how those lessons continue to shape our future. Well, welcome to Avon Talks. This evening we have Professor Stephan Bullard from the University of Hartford. He's a professor of biology. What was your first impression when you first heard about COVID emerging out of Wuhan, China?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting. My background, I'm a marine biologist, but I've got really interested in emergency medicine. I was an EMT for a while, certified. And as part of that, with my teaching load, I teach many of these undergraduate students who are going into the health fields. So I've sort of developed this sort of interest in medicine in general, but mostly pandemic diseases of all things. And so I had historically done some work on the Ebola outbreak back in 2014 through about 16. I published a book about a day-by-day chronicle of everything that happened during that particular epidemic. And so I was sort of primed to keep an eye out for any kind of new emerging diseases. So one of the things I do every morning is I get in the office and I check various sites to see if anything's popped up anywhere. And there'll be disease outbreaks here and there. And occasionally these new mystery diseases will pop up, probably about once every 2 or 3 months, where there's an outbreak of something. They don't know what it is. Could be fatalities, could just be spreading. And they do some investigations to figure out what it is. They're always interesting because you never know what you're going to find. Most of the time, though, they just resolve into some known ailment, malaria or something, and they disappear from sort of the public record. But once in a while, they become interesting. And so I was leading a group at the University of Hawaii. Our students at the University of Hartford, we have a special program during the winter where we take a group of our honors kids to Hawaii for a Polynesian cultural experience. I was leading that, and I came across the outbreak in Wuhan. And immediately I was interested. It's like, oh, here's this new disease. We don't know what it is. It's spreading. They thought it was a pneumonia-type thing. If people are familiar, if you know the SARS outbreak, immediately when I heard pneumonia, China, I started thinking it could be another SARS outbreak, as other people were thinking too. But that was on January 5th. And from that day on, literally moving forward, I checked every day for any more news about that particular outbreak.
When did you realize that that was going to affect daily life here in Avon?
Good question. So I was following it really closely. And so January 5th was when I picked it up. For a week or two, you'd get some news about, this thing is still spreading. We've got more cases. For a while, they thought they had it under control. It seemed like it might be sort of dying down, and then it emerged again. Then it started spreading to new countries. So I was really kind of anxious about it. Maybe towards about January 15th, 16th, I started to think there could be something to this. On January 26th, I realized that this was going to be a big event because on that day, a couple of really valuable sort of bits of information were released. One saying that this new disease, by that point, they had identified it as a coronavirus, had a 10 to 14-day incubation period, and it had what we call an R0 of 2.6. What that means, if you got an incubation period of 10 to 14 days, you have people who are infected who are wandering around and they don't seem like anything's wrong for maybe up to a couple weeks, and they're infectious, they can spread it. So that's a problem. An R0 tells you how many people an individual who's infected will tend to infect. Anything above a 1 says that it's something that's going to be spreading in the community. And at 2.6, it's not that high, but it's a pretty high level. So knowing that we had a disease that we didn't really know anything about, it was already getting to new countries, it had an incubation period of up to a couple weeks, and had a really high R0, I basically knew on January 26th that this was going to be a big event, and I suspected it would probably be a pandemic that would actually reach us in Avon.
You didn't feel like myself, I felt kind of isolated by time. I knew about like 1918 and the pandemic at that time, and I had figured that like science and medicine had already had it licked. You more skeptical
Yes.
and more realistic than I was, I suppose.
Well, I don't know if I'm more skeptical. I just read more into it because when I was in grad school, I was always interested in this. And I wrote my PhD in Atlanta, right near the CDC. So I'd go to the CDC library and just read various things just because I thought it was interesting when I had free time. And I was interested in pandemics. So I'd read about the 1918 disease and all these things. And this was back in the mid 90s, late 90s, actually. But there were some really interesting articles I read that suggested if a new sort of pandemic type disease emerged, every model they ever sort of threw at it said that we could never contain it and it would spread and become a problem. So I found that fascinating. So I was always interested in these things. And when you get something that's basically, appeared to be an airborne vector, long incubation period, this is exactly the kind of thing that's going to spread. So although I was hopeful that it would go away, yeah, I was very anxious.
How did the early days of the pandemic impact your work and your students?
For a long time, it didn't really impact us at all. Now, long time is really relative because keep in mind that the first day that the World Health Organization ever heard of it was December 31st, so technically 2019. But December 31st is where they first were contacted. There was an unknown pathogen spreading. And by March 13th, the entire world had shut down. So that's 75 days. You think about March 15th as sort of your endpoint. So in a period of 75 days, we went from absolutely nothing wrong to the entire world had shut down. So the early part of the pandemic is really only a couple of weeks. And during that time, realistically, we didn't have any impact at all. I was studying this. My dean was aware that I was studying this. He knows that, I'm interested in this kind of stuff, and he would love to come down with articles and show me, hey, Bullard, this thing just came out that, it's under contained, we're fine, nothing's going to happen. I'd be like,
you were
okay.
still at an arm's length from the whole thing. Yeah, right.
Exactly. And so he kept trying to put the optimism into me, but I was still anxious. But yeah, it kept spreading for a while. Nothing really happened. And realistically, I would say that at least the university community, nothing really major started to happen until mid to end February. And then this is an exponential growth thing. So it snowballs. Basically nothing, a little bit, a lot, a ton amount. So it spread quickly once it hit.
What were some of the first changes you noticed in Avon?
Some of the first things I saw was just my day-to-day life, going to, mostly Big Y is where I do most of my shopping. And one of the things that I noticed, I was already, again, January 15th or January 5th, I was recording data. The way I record data is I just cruise the web constantly and grab every article I can and write down everything that's happening with the disease. So I was kind of aware of this. But I was also recording my own experiences. Anything that I personally saw, I would write down just for my own interest, but then it ended up being useful for my book. And so for a while, not much happened, but I started to notice maybe towards the end of January that I'd be in Big Y and hey, suddenly the glove aisle is kind of empty or there's relatively little rice. And for a while, I wasn't sure if it had anything to do with COVID, but then probably about, probably the end of February, I was at ShopRite in Canton and my wife and I were actually looking at the aisle of gloves and masks and they were all empty. And we were like, I wonder if this has anything to do with COVID. And suddenly this woman came by and grabbed one of the workers and said, hey, do you have any masks? I want to protect myself from COVID. We're like, oh, yeah, probably that. So that's probably the first stuff I started to see around Avon was just little hints here and there, maybe people stocking up, maybe people getting some stuff in case it went bad.
Yeah, I had similar observations with litter too.
Oh, no way.
Well, I mean, gloves. I think in that period of time, when somebody wore a mask on their face, it was sort of freakish, and it became the norm rather quickly. How did local institutions like schools or town offices handle the early confusion?
I think you hit the nail on the head there with confusion. It was one of the interesting things that I learned from the pandemic was I've been expecting possibly an outbreak of a pandemic at some point in my life, but sort of like you were saying, how you kind of thought we had everything under control. My assumption was there could be a pandemic and something would happen, but that, okay, we may not be able to contain the disease, but we can deal with the ramifications. We can, take care of people. We can make sure people have food. We can make sure schools are, functioning well. And it came as a shock to me that essentially there was no centralization. Everyone just was left to their own devices. So every state was left to their own devices, basically every city, every town. And so chaos really sums it up. As you're watching it, or as I was watching it, I'd see places where schools are shut down almost immediately. Others where they didn't shut down until literally they were kind of forced to. Locally, Avon, I have to admit, I wasn't keeping my eye that much on Avon unless something popped up. But locally, in terms of Connecticut, we were kind of ahead of the curve, partly because we're near New York City, which was an early epicenter. But we tended to take activities pretty early to try to contain any sort of spread. That was including some of the closing of schools, although my wife was an elementary school librarian. Her school did not close until March 13th. Many of them had closed earlier than that. But yeah, I think really chaos is what sums it up for me.
As a biology professor, how'd you explain the virus to your students and peers?
Yeah, that was interesting. Pretty quickly, I became the campus expert. And for a while, I was known as sort of like the Chicken Little, like, oh, the sky's falling, the sky's falling. And then when the sky fell, they were like, oh, my God, Bullard, no. And they'd come to me with all these questions.
A prophet.
Yes, a dark prophet. So they would come to me with all sorts of questions, including some of my faculty members were planning on trips abroad because it was coming up on our spring break. Spring break for us was the middle of March. One of my professors, my friends, she came to me because her daughter was in Nepal and she was planning on going to visit Nepal. The first week of March, she came and asked if she thought she should take that trip. At that point, again, things snowballed. It was bad, but wasn't horrible yet. But I encouraged her not to go because at that point, internationally, they were putting in different types of quarantines. And I said, look, we don't know what's going to happen. You plan to be leaving in 3 or 4 days and be gone for a couple of weeks. 2 weeks is a lifetime with this pandemic. We don't know what will happen, but you could get lost in, another country. You could be quarantined somewhere, maybe not be able to get back to the U.S. My students, interestingly enough, they tended to be a little bit more on the clueless side. They knew something was happening, but students tend to be focused more on their own social and personal lives, and they saw this as very much as an external threat until the school actually started to take measures to, close campus and stuff. Up until then, they were a little curious about it. I get a few questions, oh, what's this COVID stuff? But most of them were not really individually impacted until we actually started to close the schools.
How do you think the scientific community communicated with the public during the crisis, especially in the early days when it broke?
Yeah, it was actually really fascinating. So in the early days, I felt they did a great job. The World Health Organization kind of take point. They're dealing with this, the CDC. A lot of these agencies that have tremendous experience dealing with disease outbreaks really went to the fore and started doing some amazingly good work. And they were really good at keeping contact with people, lay people, and explaining kind of what they knew, steps you might be able to take to protect yourself, and what they thought might be happening with the disease. Where it started to get muddled was kind of in the middle, maybe late February, early March, where unfortunately in the modern world, we have a strong political divide, especially in America, often in Western countries as well. Things started to get a little bit more political. And then as opposed to just hearing what the scientists were saying and what their recommendations were, different groups started to put political spin on it in all sorts of different ways. And so it started to get kind of
by March,
It definitely became worse over time. By the end of April, it was particularly bad. But even early on, there were different spins you'd hear in different places that made it difficult to know what the scientists were saying. Now, to be fair, scientists are really conservative. And if you go back and listen to some of those early broadcasts, they're not necessarily particularly helpful. We have a disease that's spreading. Please wash your hands frequently and avoid people who are sick. Helpful, but not necessarily, specific steps you might be able to take to help yourself.
And you were documenting these things daily.
Yes.
With recordings, with articles, with all across all types of media.
Yeah, mostly actually through news sites. No real audio, a little bit. But I'd cruise the web, and what I do is every time I found an article, it could be a scientific article, it could be a government website, it could be a health agency, or I got a lot of stuff from actually just the common media. I would immediately make a copy of that paper or that article because they tend to be ephemeral. You have this paper that comes out, they present what they know at that exact moment, and then 10 hours later, they get some new information. They come back and edit that article. So if you don't save it as it comes out, you can't then go back retroactively and figure out what's happened. So I spent a huge amount of time just archiving article after article after article. And so the end result, though, I have now, forget the exact number, somewhere 8,000 or 9,000 articles related to it. chronologically.
That's pretty comprehensive.
Relatively, yes.
What were the biggest misunderstandings you observed about the virus and how it spread? You just told me that it was likely to spread. What do you think spooked people locally and otherwise?
Yeah, I think people understood reasonably early how it did spread, and so we knew that there was very much a airborne component. You could get it from being relatively close to people. You'd often hear things about close contacts, which was kind of defined usually as people within maybe 6 feet of each other for 15 minutes. Again, kind of rough numbers, but we know it's an airborne type thing, and we also know that you can get it by coming into contact with, say, droplets or something on a counter. So people learned pretty quickly that what you wanted to do was to, the classic term, socially distance, try to stay away from people. If you're in public, try to stay at least 6 feet, preferably 10 feet apart if you can. Try not to interact with many people. And those two steps by themselves, those were very valuable. Then if you started to add in things like wearing a face mask, that's also really helpful. One thing that I did, which I rarely saw, was gloves. It turns out COVID's a little bit of a funny bird because it does actually do a lot of infection just aerosolly by breathing it in. Most people assume that's how you get the flu too, but generally not. Usually you infect yourself with the flu by touching something and then having those particles on your fingers. You then at some point touch your eye or your mouth and you infect yourself that way. Gloves work really well because what they do is, okay, you still get it on your hands, but when you wear a glove, you're really unlikely to touch your eye or your mouth, and so it keeps it away. So those were useful, but again, rarely I saw people wearing those.
Yeah, I was kind of personally terrified to touch my face for a year. It sounds very strange now, but I don't. Maybe I hope I wasn't the only one, right?
No, I think you're right in track.
Did you see a rise in student interest in biology or public health as a result of the pandemic?
Interesting. It's hard to say. We have a massive number of students, and it's been a growing number in recent years, who are interested in the health fields. I think there's two things driving it. One easily could be COVID, because there's this big event that they were all exposed to. Jim, you and I are older, so this is just one part of our lives. My students, the ones that I have now, that was a massive portion of their developing period. When they're in their adolescence, this was this huge event. So it is life-changing for everybody, but for them in just a totally different way. So I wouldn't be surprised, they've never specifically told me, that many of them were maybe interested because of the experience they had with the pandemic. However, I think a lot of them too, there's also a big push in the last few years to get a degree and to study something that is marketable, that you can get a job with. And there's nothing more marketable than health fields. So we see lots of students interested in that.
How did the pandemic expose or deepen social health inequities in the Farmington Valley or in Connecticut, do you think? I'm sure that follows through till today, right? I mean,
yeah, inequalities, they prop up and then they persist and often get worse. I got to admit, I don't specifically know. My best guess by looking at it is that people have access to different resources. So during the pandemic, something as simple as a face mask, they were often free, at least late in the pandemic, but not early in the pandemic. So people had access to different abilities to protect themselves. Also, inequality in terms of how much money you have. I'm, reasonably well off. I'm a professor, so I was able to stockpile food. Once it got bad, I had a reasonable amount of food, so I wouldn't have to go out all the time and keep buying more and more groceries and exposing myself. People with fewer resources may not have that opportunity. So they may not have had the personal protective equipment that others might have. They might have had to go and actually get more resources more often. So we're more at risk. And so they might have gotten ill at higher rates than other people. I don't know for that for sure, but likely. And those things tend to persist. So if you had people who maybe got ill during the pandemic, we know there's the problem of long COVID. It's especially true of people who got sick early in the pandemic. They tend to have stronger symptoms over time. So those types of inequalities can keep going for long periods of time after an event.
Yeah, you talk about stockpiling, and I remember in the supermarket then where they had arrows essentially setting up the supermarket like a maze type of thing. So people would go in a certain direction in the supermarket and maintain that direction and space between them. That's unique. Were there any ethical dilemmas in terms of public health mandates or vaccine distribution that stood out to you? I'm rushing ahead of myself here because we're already at vaccine level here. But
No worries, no worries.
yep.
Yeah, there's a lot, and it sort of ties back into sort of the just general chaos with the entire situation. Again, the thing that really struck me was that there was no universal mandate or effort, at least not really, by any central authority in the United States or in the world to kind of figure out what, quote, everybody should do. So everyone was kind of left to their own devices. One of the most fascinating things from sort of the later part of the outbreak, May and June, are these ever-changing requirements of, things that are shut down, things that are open, mask mandates, no mask mandates, and how they rolled within individual states, but especially across states. If you look across states, you'd often have neighboring states that had literally the exact opposite requirements. So that to me was surprising. I figured once something bad happened, we would all work together to, ensure the common good. Where the problem came with that is, well, okay, great. I think in general we did, but what's the common good? Is the common good preventing spread of the disease? Is the common good protecting individual freedoms? People have different definitions. So because of that, we had different motivations for doing different things, and different agencies, states, regions would do things dramatically differently in ways that I would not have predicted.
And I can remember I was working in Simsbury at that time, and the rules for Simsbury were different from Avon and Canton, and people really ended up becoming quite hostile to that if they relaxed mask mandates in Avon and people were required to wear them in Simsbury. They would say, well, why is that? I can go over to Avon and I can shop. I'm going to shop in Avon because they don't require masks. I mean, what do you think of that level of decentralization?
Yeah, that's where the chaos comes in, right? Because, and rightly so. I mean, if you have places, Simsbury and Avon, 2 miles apart, and they have dramatically different requirements, well, then to be generous, leave everything out aside, at the very least, it causes mass confusion. What do I have to do here? What do I have to do there? And if there's something you're not particularly excited about, maybe you're not one of the people who wants to wear a mask, easy enough, drive to Avon. So yeah, it just becomes really challenging in those situations.
Do you think, historically, if we were comparing that, and I know we're maybe talking apples and oranges, but not totally, if we compared that to policies that were implemented during the Spanish flu, say 100 years before that, what would you say would be the same and what was different? I mean, I remember something that struck me as particularly strange is they were saying to wash your hands and cover your face. And I thought to myself, that might be the same thing that they told people in 1918. I'm not really relaxed about that.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. That is basically what they said. 1918, only 100 years ago, but a dramatically different time period. Just getting through World War I, more people died of the Spanish influenza than the entire World War I entire event, which is crazy. People had a different attitude towards human existence back then. Not that we're any better, we're just different. But especially coming after the war, life was sort of considered at a cheaper level. So people didn't necessarily worry as much as, okay, well, what do we do to protect everybody? They tend to be focused a little bit more individually. But then what you'd also find is that may well be the case, but then we were also more homogeneous in how just the country itself acted. So whereas in the modern era, we have this massively polarized group of people, back then people were much more uniform. So it was easier to pass different types of legislation that people would follow. Much less debate and much less resistance. So a different time period, but yeah, very similar kind of responses. Because realistically, to protect yourself from a disease, cover your face, wash your hands, some of the best things you can do.
I mean, do you find that the least bit ironic, though, as a century passed and we've made seemingly endless scientific advances, and yet, until the vaccine was developed, it seemed to be business as usual.
Yeah, no, interesting enough, I think this is where I become sort of the cynic, and the pandemic really kind of brought this to the fore. As I say, my assumption had been that, okay, bad things are going to happen, but when it occurs, we're going to pull together and do, quote, the right thing. In my mind, the right thing is trying to prevent the spread of illness and lower fatalities. That's
and generally that did happen.
Certainly did, especially early in the pandemic. But what I've also seen is that a couple things. People get tired of doing that pretty quickly. And so although we might have these things in place for weeks or maybe even a month or two, people are reluctant to continue on further. The other aspect of this, though, is that it is a tiny bit apple and oranges because the 1918 outbreak had a bit of a higher fatality rate. COVID-19 is a major world-changing event. But in many ways, it's a pandemic on training wheels because the fatality of COVID is only about 2%. So 1 in 50 people who get it will die from it. Most other major diseases, and especially most other pandemics, have a much higher fatality rate. So what you see with the COVID pandemic, not only is the fatality rate relatively low, it also affected a relatively small portion of the population, and that older people were more affected than others. With that, people took steps to try to control it, but for many people, my students in particular, younger folks, it didn't seem as immediate. They didn't seem as much at risk as, say, the people in a nursing home. With the 1918 outbreak, that was very different. The people who died there were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. So people in general responded to it more strongly because they saw themselves at risk. What I am curious about, this is not the last pandemic. Pandemics happen pretty frequently, on average about once every 100 years. But as human population increases, as we become more connected, which we are, we anticipate they'll become more common. Could be an outbreak of something we're familiar with, but more likely something that we're unfamiliar with. In all likelihood, if we get a new pandemic, which we will, just a matter of time, it will probably be worse than COVID. It may not spread as quickly. COVID had really good dynamics in terms of being able to spread from place to place, but a low mortality. But the next one, probably a 10% mortality, maybe even higher. The Black Death, 50%. And some places it was 70 or 80%. In a situation like that, although we may not have learned as much from COVID as I would have liked, my hope is that we will then be much more interested in doing something prophylactically to prevent the massive spread of mass mortality. But we shall see when that happens.
Which leads nicely into my next question, actually. Have you seen changes in how people think about public health and hygiene locally as far as, say, like you said, preventing the next pandemic?
Yeah, but interestingly enough, in what I would say a negative way. What I've discovered just from talking to random people these days is that, yeah, everyone remembers the pandemic, but the general impression I get from talking to them is that they feel that we just overreacted. It wasn't really that big a deal. The world freaked out, and then we came to our senses, and, things kind of moved on. They've kind of forgotten the early days when there was no vaccine. Everyone was at risk. Literally, hospitals, their morgues were full, so they had to have trailer trucks in their parking lot filled with bodies. They've kind of forgotten that aspect and then remember we have the vaccine, everything's okay. Because of that, my impression is they, in their own mind, dramatically underplay what COVID really was. And so unfortunately, I think they might have taken and are getting the wrong message, in my opinion, of that, we overreacted last time, so the next time we won't. We'll just, we'll be ready to go next time. We won't have to worry about it, but we'll see.
Well, yeah, because as I recall, there was any number of people that were on breathing machines. I mean, those things were very real until there was a vaccine. How did the pandemic reshape your teaching methods or curriculum?
Oh, dramatically. During the pandemic and the year after the pandemic, it was dramatic. We instigated all these different teaching strategies. We developed a lot of online teaching, which we hadn't really done before. One of the things that we did the fall semester after the main outbreak for the March, April, May area. So going into that fall, we instigated a thing where we had half our students in our classroom at a time. The other half was home watching at home. The next day they'd flip. So the kids at home would come to the classroom. The kids in the classroom would go home. We would record our lectures and let them get access to them in that way. But a very, very different kind of thing. I think that's had some repercussions in the long term in the sense that we've seen since the pandemic, students in some ways they kind of like that. And they like the idea that, they didn't have to be in class and they could get access to information in different ways. And as a result, our attendance has been not as good as one might like since the pandemic, with students asking, oh, would you just send me a video? Well, we don't do that anymore. But yeah, so it's changed it in that way.
And the whole idea was to stagger how often students were in the classroom for just to minimize exposure.
Exactly. To minimize the number of students at any point in time to minimize exposure. And the reason we had to do that is people may or may not recall there was a mandate, a sliding mandate, that schools would reopen, but students initially had to stay at least 6 feet apart and then 3 feet apart. If you're familiar with college classrooms, that's a 6-foot mandate is incredibly hard to deal with. But even a 3-foot mandate's difficult. If you have a classroom with 30 students, they're all packed in there really close. So with a 3-foot mandate, realistically, you can only have about 15 students.
Do you think we're better prepared now for future pandemics than we were in 2019, six years later?
I do not. And the reason why I sort of alluded to, which is saying that, the take-home message many people have is that, okay, it really wasn't that bad and we overreacted. So that's as a sort of like the general population level kind of a bad take-home message. But then if you look around at public health these days, it's from somebody who's interested in public health under attack. We basically cut our ties with the World Health Organization. The CDC is not what it used to be and is not focused on these types of things at the moment. Again, I would imagine that would change overnight if we popped up with some new pandemic type scenario. But at the moment, I would say that compared to 2019, our health institutions are dramatically weaker than they were.
Okay, it leads me nicely into the next question, too. What advice would you give to future students or citizens about how to respond to a public health crisis?
Ooh, excellent. It would depend on what it is. So we'd have to know what disease it is, what's going on. The main thing I'd say is listen to experts. Real experts, don't listen to pundits on any side, but pay attention to the people who are actually studying the stuff and can make you a good recommendation about what kind of activities will put you at risk, what things can keep you safe. And in a case like COVID, yeah, you want to isolate yourself from people as much as possible, maintain a large distance, wear a mask if you can, wash your hands frequently, and as soon as vaccine becomes available, get the vaccine. But we'll have to depend on what actually happens with our next outbreak.
Do you have any stories you'd like to share, any memories, that are not so academic, just, some personal experiences maybe that happened in Avon or happened at University of Hartford that you might like to share?
Yeah, I can share a couple. One is a personal one that didn't happen in Hartford or anything. But as I say, COVID was a pandemic on training wheels, but that means it wasn't nothing. I personally know 10 people who died of COVID, including one of my college roommates. I'm 53. He's my age. He was in the hospital. This was in North Carolina with just an injured leg. Caught COVID. This was early on. I think it was in April. Caught COVID while he was in the hospital and died. So a sort of atypical type case because he was younger. But again, in the early days, many people were at risk. So personally, again, this was a major dramatic event. Somebody I was very close to passed away from that disease. Locally, on a nicer note, I just remember many of the things I remember driving through Canton, actually, and seeing a sign that said, "We'll trade skis for toilet paper," because you'll recall that toilet paper
was a big deal.
It was. That was, oddly enough, that was one of the things I was most paranoid about. Early in January, not only I started to stockpile a little bit of food, but I started to stockpile toilet paper. By the time March hit, I had 60 rolls, so I was very pleased. But yeah, that was definitely a difficult thing to come by. I also just remember being in Big Y and just the chaos involved. One thing that strikes me, and again, studying health and disasters, which didn't really surprise me per se, was that on March 13th, I went in for a final purchase before we were going to start hunkering down, and Big Y was packed, so much that I had a cart. I could barely move the cart. I'd usually have to wait for someone to move it. When I got to the cash registers, I forgot, I'd have to look back on my numbers, but I think there were 10 people ahead of me. It took me almost half an hour to get to the register and then clear out. But the thing that amazed me was that everyone was very polite. Everyone was very nice. You always see these videos in like movies and stuff of, people just panicking and freaking out. During real disasters, people are extraordinarily nice and very, very helpful individually, and definitely saw that. And then just also being there and seeing the crazy things people were buying. One guy I saw filling his cart with Oreos. You just, you can't have enough Oreos, but different people responding different ways to the same major stress.
Yeah, I had experienced the same thing too. The cooperation really outweighed the resistance, and that is encouraging. That's encouraging in Avon, and as a whole was encouraging across the United States.
Very much, yes, very much so.
How did the rapid development of mRNA vaccines change the future of biology and medicine?
Oh, yeah, that is a good question. This is really fascinating. So many people who are not in the health field don't really understand how vaccines works or how they're developed. Interesting enough, people were working on a vaccine for COVID by about the end of January, and they had candidates that might be viable around that time. Because one of the nice things is in the modern world, although our health systems may not be as good as they were historically, we do have a lot of interesting new techniques and new understanding. And if you can identify a pathogen, especially a virus, you can probably develop a vaccine pretty quickly. Now, the catch, you can develop the vaccine. I can't because I don't do this. But if it was me, I could probably crank one out in a couple of weeks. But just because you have a vaccine doesn't mean you can use it. Then you have to test it, make sure that, you don't inject it in people and it kills them or does bad things. So having the vaccine and being able to use it will take some time. But if you're familiar with it, we had a vaccine, I forget the exact day, but by fall, we had an active vaccine that people were being injected with, which is amazing.
And you said it was being worked on by February, so that was even before people really realized how grave a situation would be.
Yep.
What are your thoughts on how science and politics intersected during the pandemic and how they continue to intersect or not intersect?
And will continue to do so.
Right.
It's frustrating to me from somebody who does two things, deals with health stuff, and then I also deal with environmental issues as a marine biologist. Two things that I think should never be politicized are health and the weather. I mean, these are just things that we're exposed to. People want to personify things, so they'll put a human touch on something. COVID is, quote, evil or something like that. COVID's just a disease. It's just a thing that happens to exist. But people kind of lose sight of that. And as a result, things get weird. And then not only the disease itself, but also people's responses to it become politicized. And again, to me, that is just crazy. This is just a random event in nature. We just have to deal with it. But because of that, people will do things that, in my opinion, are odd because of their personal beliefs, one way or the other. They might, I remember people touting different types of, quote, cures or treatments for COVID that had never been tested. And just somebody came up with this idea and people would start doing it because in their little community, the people that they listened to on Facebook and that they saw maybe on the news were telling them this is a good thing without any data. That to me is frustrating. But I think that unfortunately at this moment, I hope this moment changes, but at this moment, I think that's kind of where we're at, where people are so entrenched, especially in America, in their personal viewpoint on existence, be it, national politics, things like global warming and things like that, that it's so difficult for them to step outside their particular viewpoint and look at the other, whichever side you might be on, because both sides actually usually have pretty valid points. You just have to kind of parse out what's a real fact and what is just something that's coming out based on someone's political motivation. And that can actually be really tricky. But I think if we could come back together again as a unified group, which I don't think will happen soon, but if we could, that would make it much easier to deal with the next pandemic.
Your publication on the pandemic, how, if you don't mind me asking, how many pages of information is that?
Many. So when you publish stuff, you usually don't do it by page count, you do it by word count. So it's 250,000 words. My Ebola book that came out was 100,000 words, and it was 315 pages. So roughly the same size, probably about 600 or 700 pages.
And if someone was to draw a conclusion, say in the future, they were using Professor Stephan Bullard's document as a primary source, 50 years from now, 100 years from now, what conclusions would you like them to draw?
Excellent. Yeah, I initially did not want to put this in, and my editor said, you must put this in. Because my theory was what I was doing was I'm a chronicler. I keep track of what's happening. So I'm kind of like Herodotus. I'm not, making the news. I'm just recording the news. But not surprisingly, they said, well, what's your take-home messages? And I resisted, but I put them in. The take-home messages I came from this were actually pretty straightforward. One is that, as I'd already seen when I was in grad school, that if a pandemic type disease comes out, we cannot contain it. It is going to spread. because the things we try to do, put in quarantines and stuff, because of the way the world works, they're always behind the eight ball. And even if you have an effective quarantine, or if you put one in, it's only as effective as the people who are willing to maintain it. And what we find is quarantines are always leaky. So not only have they come in too late, the disease has already spread, but once it's in effect, people are letting different people through maybe a negative reason from bribery, maybe a positive reason through compassion. But because of all this, they don't work and the disease spreads. So we can't contain it. The second thing was that, as I already said here, COVID was bad, but it wasn't particularly bad. The next one will almost certainly be worse. My main take-home message is that people tend to think of the pandemic as a finished historical event. It's done. It's not in two ways. One, because COVID's still out there and it's still nasty. There's still many people dying from COVID today, although we tend not to hear about it. It's a different type of situation. But that's one thing. But the second thing that's even more important, we went from COVID not existing in the world to the entire world shutting down in 75 days. If we get our next pandemic that is worse, and even maybe not that bad, say it's SARS with a 10% mortality rate, but it goes from 0 to 100 in 75 days, that's major. And if we have a really bad disease, say it doesn't affect older people, say we have a disease that has the same profile as COVID, but the people who are dying are 5 to 10-year-olds. Think about how the world's going to be with that. So what I think our main take-home message is that COVID was a great wake-up call. And what we really need to do is spend some time developing effective techniques to deal with the next pandemic that is going to come.
As we close out today's conversation with Professor Stephan Bullard, we're reminded that the COVID-19 pandemic was not just a global headline, but a deeply personal chapter for every community, including ours here in Avon. His insights help stitch together the responses of the scientific community to national challenges and the international shifts that continue to influence how we live and how we work today. We're grateful for his time, his expertise, and his clarity. And to you, our listeners, thanks for joining us as we document and reflect on the moments that have shaped who we are. Until next time, I'm Jim Pabish, and this has been Avon Talks, where we bring Avon's history home, one story at a time.